I'm Zach D. Roberts, and this is the VisuNews Podcast. This is our first episode of the new year, and we're opening with a big one. I interviewed actor and documentary filmmaker Alex Winter, who you of course will know as Bill from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. For nearly as long as he's been acting, he's been directing, doing everything from TV shows like Ben 10 to documentaries like the incredible Panama Papers. Winter's latest documentary, The YouTube Effect, delves into how YouTube, its parent company, Google, and the public need to come to terms with its far-reaching influence on society. It does this quite subtly by speaking with people who know the site best, its founders and content creators. Winter told me that he did not want anyone on camera that, quote, wasn't embedded in the YouTube machine somehow. Winter speaks to content creators who have achieved Hollywood-level stardom, although you may not know them unless you're in their demographic. Ryan Kajai of Ryan's World fame is an 11-year-old with 33.6 million YouTube subscribers. Anthony Padilla was the co-creator of Smosh Channel, which had 25 million subscribers and over 10 billion video views. The influence and reach of these channels, especially with kids and young adults, is undeniable. But even as someone who covers online content for a living, I had never heard of either of them. Both are non-controversial figures in the YouTube world, but there are many more on that site that create edgy content for views and millions of dollars in advertising revenue. For some creators, that means becoming a gateway to the alt-right pipeline. For years, YouTube's algorithm pushed videos to viewers that it believed they would like based on videos they had previously watched, which usually meant ones with a large amount of interaction and controversy. This would lead people from Joe Rogan to Jordan Peterson, for example, and then to someone like white supremacist Stefan Molyneux. The film speaks to the wider issue of online polarization and the effect of social media on us all. YouTube is here to stay, unless of course Elon Musk manages to buy it, so we'll have to figure out a way to deal with it. The YouTube Effect is an important documentary about a problem that so many of us seem to just hope will resolve itself on its own. Because spoiler alert, it won't. And now here's my interview with Alex Winter.
I'm Alex Winter. I'm a filmmaker and an actor primarily, and I directed recently this documentary on YouTube and Google called The YouTube Effect that will be out in early 2023.
Fantastic. How did you decide to start directing documentaries?
Well, I mean, I've been making films for a really long time. I've been trying to make documentaries for a while alongside my narrative work because I love documentaries. And about 15 years ago, I had an independent film that I'd written for Paramount Pictures about Napster. And I was going to direct that there as a kind of an indie, like a sort of MTV Films, smaller movie about Sean Fanning primarily and Sean Parker and the very intense experience that they had launching and then being capsized by the Napster process at a very young age. And I had met them years ago and had written that movie for Paramount back in like 2000, 2001 when Napster was still going. Went to turn around. I couldn't get it off the ground. It was sort of at the time that indie movies were dying as we knew them. It was the end of an era. Streaming hadn't kicked off yet because the internet wasn't strong enough to support it yet. And eventually someone told me to try making it as a doc because I'd spent so much time working with everybody. And I sold that in like a day after a decade of trying to get it off the ground as a feature. Wow. And I had so much fun making it, I just kept going. I really love the form. I love narrative as well. I'm working on another narrative project now, but I just love the form and I love the sort of nuance of documentary and how you can get into the grays of human behavior in a way that I think is not better necessarily, but I think it's more comprehensive and different than narrative does.
Yeah. And you can be a lot more I think you can be creative in a different way than a lot of narrative, especially when you're telling a true story. I think it works.
Yes.
But you have a wide range of topics for your docs. Frank Zappa, the Panama Papers, which fantastic, absolutely one of my favorite docs. Child Stars. Why did you decide, especially at this moment, on YouTube?
Well, I mean, for me, it's funny because I feel like I make the exact same movie over and over again. So the themes that interest me are very specific, even though the topics tend to be broad. I tend to be interested in sort of non-prevailing cultural themes or ideas, people that are going against the grain of prevailing culture. Ideas and systems that are either fighting or in support of marginalized groups that are outside prevailing culture, and that has really been at the heart of every story I've told. Again, I don't have like a mandate where I don't do a story unless it fits. It's happened to evolve that way organically, but certainly those are the themes that interest me most. So. I've made several films in the tech space, going back to Napster being the very first doc. I've been around technology and the birth of the internet, and then specifically the web before the beginning of the web, well before the beginning of the web. So I have a lot of relationships in that space and a lot of interest in watching the growth of online communities specifically. That's kind of my interest in technology, is how it's capable of bringing people together for good and ill. And that's really been at the heart of those stories I've told. They've been pretty specific about an individual community. So Napster was about the first large scale internet-based community of all time by far. We'd never seen 50 to 80 million people online at once on a single database ever in the history of technology. It was a big moment. So the Deep Web movie was about the Silk Road, which was essentially the first giant anonymized black market. So it was the first anonymous online community, and what that meant, the implications of that for good and ill. And so for this one, Gail-Ann Hurd actually approached me about this because she was interested in doing something in this space and had some connections around it. And I felt like the time was right. I'd been wanting to do something about Google for a long time. I felt like for being the largest tech company in the world, in terms of its reach, it has a far bigger reach than any other company. Apple has a larger market share, I guess, but Google reaches billions more people than Apple does. I felt like it had kind of flown under the radar. And YouTube is the biggest media company on the planet. Tucked again, somewhat not secretly, but quietly under Google's umbrella. I was amazed how few people even knew that they were connected as a company. And so I immediately jumped at it. It felt like the time was right, and I was ready. I'd just done Zappa and Showbiz Kids. I'd done 2 films about entertainment, essentially, and certainly cultural thematic issues, but within entertainment. And I wanted to get back in the tech space, and also greedily, I wanted to do something about what was going on politically at the time. I'd been working on a QAnon doc that got capsized by COVID because it required being out in the field with all these families. That was my approach. And COVID hit, and it made doing that impossible. So I knew that I could shoot remotely on YouTube, with crews that I have around the world that I know. So I knew it was doable during the pandemic, which is when we made it. But it would also allow me to observe and comment on technology's role in the lead up to the insurrection and sort of following on from the insurrection.
That a lot there that I want to follow up on,
sorry, I'm not capable of giving short answers. No, which is why I would be a terrible doc subject myself. I'd be like impossible to edit.
No, then you give content. It's actually sometimes it's like you get someone. I just finished a doc myself, and it's like you get somebody who goes yes, no, maybe.
That's heartbreaking.
That's very useful. No, but it's fascinating because one thing, as I do research for my work, is trying to get past the Google and then immediate YouTube and then the ads that Google's serving you. It's shocking, like how, especially if you're like researching disinformation or researching, COVID. I was at all the protests and covered the anti-mask and anti-mandate protests. And the fact that you have to like somehow get through that, and the fact that how difficult it is to find actual information on Google now, and the fact that Google is it's it. I mean, like Bing exists, but it's literally,
Yeah.
I mean, they use it. It's a joke. I mean, it's like as a joke on television.
Yeah, DuckDuckGo doesn't work either, and they've also not been great with giving information away, even though they claim to be pro privacy, and so I sort of gave up on them as well for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, so it's difficult to find kind of any information unless you're on YouTube, and also have figured out how to game that system of of the algorithm. So one thing that's really great about this film is that it's really subtle. Like the first time I watched it, I was actually kind of questioning. I'm like, wait, where? I know your work, and I'm like, where's this going? Because this is like, it's not that it's gentle. It's not like there's no point at the film where you're like, is this a pro YouTube documentary? But it's like it's a very slow build to, and I think it's just like really subtle that somebody who is not, it's not necessarily, there's a lot of people still out there going, oh, YouTube doesn't have that sort of influence. Like people just don't watch like stupid videos online and then suddenly decide to, break down the doors of the Capitol building. And I think that your film does that really well. How is that choice kind of going about, as opposed to just like starting? I mean, because this film starts out, aggressively with the opening credits, but then like it kind of like immediately calms down and then just a slow build.
Because for me, in my experience with people and technology, there's real faces behind these companies, and there's real human beings back there. And, it's not like you don't have these sort of larger than life tech villains or heroes, I guess. But mostly you don't. Mostly you just have people. I mean, you have nuanced people who are trying to do something interesting or good, largely, or make money, whatever their motives might be. And I feel like what's really lacking from a lot of the tech stories and a lot of the tech documentaries that I see is an examination of these people as people. And I think that that's very distancing, and it makes it harder to really understand the truth of how these systems work and it's kind of like what happened in the film industry when CGI really took over. Everyone was like, oh, you can just, you can make Jurassic Park by pushing a button. It's like, no, you can't. There's an artist back there. It's just, they're using different tools, right? Like, Spielberg took everybody from, all of the animatronic world and the claymation world, and they brought them up to Skywalker, and they trained them on CG, and it takes incredible craft. Now, we may not like everything about CG. We may not like, there may be aspects of it that feel cold or inhuman. And likewise in technology, there are aspects of technology that feel repellent. And I think that genuinely are repellent because it's early days. But I really wanted a first act in the film that humanized these folks, and showed us how they evolved, how YouTube evolved in a very human, real way, and that there were actual people back there. Before we got into the ramifications of it's kind of like reading Frankenstein, right? Like you spend a lot of time with the doctor before the monster shows up and you're off to the races. And I think it was similar in our case. I think we really wanted to humanize the creation of this beast before the beast grew a brain of its own and took off.
Because I mean, that's one thing that I don't think I noticed it like really well the first time, but the second time I watched it, I noticed, wait a minute, other than like one of the creators of YouTube and the current, there's basically everybody that is on camera is a YouTube creator talking about their experience with it and how, and kind of in a larger, you picked really great people to talk about these issues, because they're just not like, oh, well, then the algorithm changed and I couldn't figure out how to make money, so I decided to do something else. Because that's, that's right. Usually, that's the story with a lot of people who are like, oh, well, the algorithm now requires you to do 10 minutes or above, and that just doesn't fit my, thing. That because also like the experts, you have just as a voice over it, which was, how much was that a choice? How much was that COVID, filmmaking technicals?
It was a choice. I mean, normally I liked the idea of showing their photographs and having a connective sense of who they were visually. But I like in documentary to just have certain people being a vocal presence. I also, because I come from a narrative background, I tend to think in a narrative way. And to me, my docs are usually about an ensemble cast. And you have a very core, very small group of people that isn't too broad, that are driving the narrative. And that's the case here. You have Susan, you have Steve, you have Brianna, you have Natalie, you have Ryan, you have this very core group of people that are my cast. And then you have kind of ancillary cast. And to your point, I really didn't want anyone on camera that the audience would connect to in a visceral way that wasn't embedded in the YouTube machine somehow.
Yeah,
that was very important to me. And sometimes it's sneaky, like you don't realize Brianna's connection at first. You don't realize Carrie's connection. Then you're like, oh, I see. They actually, Brianna was actually on the Google teams, and everybody has a place within that ecosystem.
It's interesting because I've been obviously trying to working on my own stuff and trying to figure out how to explain to people how we got where we are now. And this film does that really well, like specifically when it comes to YouTube. But it's just I don't think that people really understand the importance of Gamergate on how the internet changed. I always say I don't think that Donald Trump is president without Gamergate. And that's a lot of people are like, wait, what? Because that's a wild track. It's just it's just some online thing that happened. But the fact that was allowed to happen, no one stopped it. No one has really been called to anything for it. And now we got here. Just thoughts or?
Yeah, I agree with you. I've had a similar frustration with the lack of the media making the very obvious connect the dots to a bunch of things that went on that all conspired to get us to the insurrection, even beyond Trump's election, that got us to a civic, sort of a corner of the populace that felt emboldened enough to attack the Capitol and eventually kill people. And I don't think you have that without Gamergate. I don't think that you have the internet is very, very powerful and it's very proliferate. So once a narrative is spun and once people feel confident that their voice is being heard, that's very empowering, very similar to how any fascist uprising has occurred throughout history. And it's often started on the fringes and then worked its way to the center. And then next thing you know, they're doing terrible things. And, I made the film. What was frustrating me was even I didn't see people connecting the dots to YouTube, even though it was flagrantly obvious how much they had to do with the emboldening of these groups. And then as studies showed, as we show in the film, the literal radicalizing of the groups that overtook the Capitol. So, I find these dots very easy to connect. There's nothing conspiratorial about them. They're very basic, obvious, low-hanging fruit kind of facts. But they're not, they're sort of not friendly facts, right? They're facts that a lot of folks don't want to really talk about because they offend various folks in power or people who have a lot of lobbying power.
Yeah, I mean, because it's also really terrifying how I saw this just testing it out. Okay, so I watch a Joe Rogan clip, and then I get Stefan Molyneux, and then sometimes it's a lot more subtle than that because it's Stefan Molyneux, especially considering he's an open white nationalist now or white supremacist now. But it's how quickly and how subtly and often or subtly you can just be drawn right into that. And by the way, thank you for actually mentioning him in the film, because it's these guys that are kind of our mainstream voices, people like Joe Rogan, enormous Spotify deal, I don't know how much more mainstream you can get kind of than $100 million deal with Spotify at this point in the way it is. And I don't think that people realize that enough. I mean, there's not necessarily a question there, but if your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that it's been a sneaky transition. And it happened somewhat intentionally in that there was great money to be made by promoting these voices. And so people were disingenuous about their lack of knowledge of what Crowder or Rogan or Molyneux were doing. And I think some of those people are even disingenuous, like, well, hey, I just we just want to hear everybody's point of view. Right?
Yeah. Tim Pool, I used to know him. I know him from Occupy Wall Street, and watching his extraordinary slide towards what he is now.
Well, I was on Rogan with, when I did Deep Web, a lot of people wanted me on their shows, and it was early days enough, because this was like 2015, that I didn't really listen to any of these people. I didn't really know, and they weren't sort of outwardly. Some of them I would come off the show going, oh shit, what did I just do? And I did, and I had to really check myself. Yeah. But that does happen. It still happens to me, because you do stuff about politics, you'll end up on someone's podcast or whatever. And even if you do your due diligence, you're like, oh, this person's kind of a crackpot, or they're saying terrible things, and I wish I hadn't been on.
Yeah. There's this great interview with Noah Shackman, the current Rolling Stone that he did with Alex Jones, like in 2005, I think it was. And it's like hilarious because you can see him you can listen to him realizing in real time what show he's on. And it's like, oh no, this is not good.
Yeah, I think that happened to me. I didn't get interviewed by Jones himself. Yeah, but I think I ended up doing an InfoWars interview on the Silk Road story. But I went on Rogan and talked for 3 hours with him about Ross and the Silk Road case. And look, he's a really nice guy. He's got a giant audience, but and I feel the same way to a degree about certain factions within YouTube. It's like there's a disingenuity to, we're just wanting to show both sides, or we just want to let other people give their point of view, when you're promoting straight up, either white supremacist propaganda or anti-COVID vaccine propaganda, and people are dying or they're shooting people because of your rhetoric, then that's direct complicity. It's not even indirect complicity.
Yeah, no, it's really easy to just go, oh, I'm just a stoner who asks questions and that sort of thing, when you're literally having a proper journalist on one day, and then the next day you're having somebody like, again, just go back to like Tim Pool and Stefan Molyneux, and you're like, well, you give them both weight then by having them on the same platform. And YouTube is obviously, as a larger thing, is a much more complicated thing, because it treats itself as just we're just a platform, anybody can put stuff up here. But then you factor in the algorithm, and what they decide really makes a huge difference. I'll upload a video, it'll be like 10,000 views in a minute, and then someday I'll upload the other nothing whatsoever. So
and there's two things at play there. There's an algorithm for sure that sort of leads you on to other things, and they've been working on that and trying to get that to do less of that type of thing. And to some degree, they've been successful. But then there's the other thing, which is just the parasocial component, which is the power of staring into a webcam at someone who's on the other end of a webcam that you believe is looking at you and talking to you. And that has enormous power. And YouTube is very aware of that power. And they're also aware, because they're an ad-supported platform, of how much money they make off of the Steve Crowders and the folks that are pumping this very violent rhetoric onto their platform. And that they don't want to go in front of their shareholders and say we're kicking folks off who are some of the biggest money makers we have. They'd lose their jobs. So that's I think the dilemma there, and I think that's where companies can get too big, and where the profit motive can overtake the type of standards and practices that have made their way into other forms of media quite necessarily. And look, it's not an easy thing to fix. A lot of people, that I know in the tech world who I have enormous respect for really feel like there's no solution. Like Section 230 can't be abolished because it would disrupt too much of the rest of the web. Content moderation is an impossible thing to actually enforce. So there's no real way they feel to actually do anything. For me, I say, okay, well, at what point, Anthony Padilla, who I love dearly, has a great quote in the movie where he just says it's like an intersection with no traffic light. At what point do we have so many accidents on this digital intersection that we say, let's put in a fucking traffic light? And that's kind of my perspective. Like, okay, really? Are we just going to throw up our hands and say, oh, well, like it's too hard to fix? Mm-hmm. You can't do that. And even if it takes time, I think we have to be working towards solutions.
Because I mean, one of the biggest solutions, like the anti-fascist activists and that sort of thing, is like really push is deplatforming, and it seems to work in different ways. Obviously, now Rumble is a thing, and there's they're building their other platform. On the other hand, that means that people can't go into that drift as easy. They can't watch Rogan. They can't watch somebody who's properly mainstream. I mean, you can watch Oprah, and then you're going down this disinformation bit with Dr. Oz and everything like that. So I mean, like, it's not to focus just on him, but and do you think? I mean, what are your thoughts on like doing?
There are lots of little things you can do that are helpful. The work that Carrie Goldberg is doing, I think, is very important work in terms of dealing with online harassment and abuse. I mean, there is activism that is really powerful. Some of the stuff that Tal Lavin is doing with the deplatforming hate organizations and things like that, very powerful. There's no doubt that getting Trump off of these platforms saved lives. There's just no doubt about that. And there's no doubt that getting Molyneux off of the platforms and getting Jones off is saving lives. It'd be great to see Steven Crowder. I mean, Steven Crowder was literally calling for war when the FBI executed a completely legal warrant on Mar-a-Lago. That called for war. I mean, it wasn't a raid, it wasn't an invasion, it was just executing a warrant. And that's war, right? So I mean, that kind of stuff is, in this day and age, with the proliferation of guns and the amount of people who are getting shot all the time, that should not be acceptable behavior. And to me, that's like a no-brainer. But there's a much bigger issue at play, in my opinion, which is that these companies are just too big. And regulation, yes, is difficult, but antitrust, anti-monopoly laws, I think we're at a point, and we come right out and say this in the film, but I think we're at a point where we have to look at the big tech companies the way we looked at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, or even the apex of the Industrial Revolution with steel, tobacco, coal, railroad. There's no difference. And I think that we have to start breaking these companies up. And I know that sounds radical. And honestly, they're so powerful and they have so much lobbying power. They're going to, if anyone ever reads this from any of those companies, they'd be like, yeah, whatever. You're not, it's not even David and Goliath. You're like a flea on the back of David's ass. Like, that's how little we care about what you're saying. So no one's going to do that right now because there's too much money preventing people from doing that. But that's what needs to happen.
Possibly final question. How did you get the interview with the head of YouTube with Susan? It's because, I mean, like, it's tough to know, like, throughout the entire film, she's just kind of, it sounds like you're just kind of giving like, oh, tell me information like you do with a general interview. And then you start asking the kind of the real questions that you need. And like, did she know what?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very transparent. I build decks before I make docs, and they literally spell out what the doc is. And I sent that to them, and I was like, look, this is what we're doing, and it's looking at the good side. It's absolutely looking at the negative side. It's looking at sort of what the ramification. I mean, the deck had like shots of the insurrection in it and things like that. But I think that a lot of folks in tech know that I'm not anti-tech. I've been around this space a long time. I have very high-powered friends in technology. My general feeling towards technology is that it's an enormous good, and it's also it's not going away, right? This is the world we live in, and we're living our lives more and more online. Look at how we're conducting this interview. And so I think we have to stop looking at tech as some kind of weird fringe thing that we can just avoid, like, I'm just going to go to the library and not use the internet. Like, it's just, you can't do that anymore. Like, we don't live in that world. I think it's very You can't have your kids not online. You can't pull their iPads away. I mean, it's kind of it's an unrealistic and counterproductive way of coming at the present day circumstances. So I didn't come at Susan as an enemy, and I have a lot of respect for what she's doing and what she's trying to do. I just think those guys are in they're inside an ecosystem that has gotten very, very large and has huge implications, and those have to be examined, however thorny the problems are.
Do you think, I mean, very quick, obviously, do you think that they have one thing I don't know if they have like a real realization of what their part is in this and also how bad it is?
I think that they have an understanding of how bad it is because we all live on the same planet and we all send our kids to school worrying that they're going to get shot. And I think the insurrection brought home for a lot of the establishment how much they're hated and how violent things can get and how sanctioned that will be by the media. And it's I think there's a sort of old school almost ancient Rome corollary of like the barbarians at the gate, and the establishment thinking, well, we've got our centurions, right? Protecting the gate. They're not coming after us. It's like, well, those days are over, right? No one is safe, and they know where you live. They will come to your house. They will attack you. Look what happened with Widmer. I mean, it's a different world. So I don't think we live in a world where people in established power don't know what's going on. But I think they're really nervous because I think that unfortunately the way that business functions and these companies function, they have to grow. They have to make as much money as humanly possible. In order to do that, they have to allow this other thing to exist. And so they're riding this line, right? They're riding the line going, how long can we keep growing and profiting before this thing either kills us literally or overtakes the company? And so I genuinely think that that's where they're sitting. I think that there's a nervousness, and I think they have to sit in front of their shareholders and say, profits are up, profits are up, profits are up. We're the biggest company on the planet. We're doing great. No one's coming anywhere near us. Meanwhile, there's this bubbling spew. And I think as far as they're concerned, there's no solution. I think that's part of the problem. I think the solution has to come from the government level, has to come from antitrust, has to come from that side. What company is going to break itself up? No company.
Well, then.
I wanted to add in this little extra bit. I did this interview for the Progressive magazine, and it was in the last print issue. Alex had to add this awesome little story about his family and his love of the magazine Progressive, where he talks about, well, let him tell it.
We've been a subscriber to Progressive going back to the early 70s.
Awesome.
And I always got Progressive magazine at home when I was a little kid, and I started reading it really young. And I don't know if you would remember this because there's no way you're old enough, but there was an issue of Progressive that published how to make a nuclear bomb, because their point was that you could literally go to the library and you could just put all of the ingredients of a nuclear bomb together and like build one and just stick it under your bed. And I had a history teacher in either middle or high school who was like obviously a super right-wing Reaganite, tub thumping reactionary, and talking about like how the government had everything under control. We were kicking Russia's ass, blah, blah. And me, like this little snot-nosed progressive at like, I don't know, 14 years old, I was like, excuse me, but anyone can build a nuclear bomb. He goes, absolutely not. I was like, I said, no, I have a magazine article, and I brought it in. He's like, can I see that? And he took it. And he never gave it back to me. And I think he genuinely thought I was going to build a nuclear bomb.
I'll talk to Norm, our publisher, and see if I can get you another copy of that if there's
Thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at ZDRoberts. You can find me on Mastodon, whatever the hell it's called, and Post, also either Zach D. Roberts or ZD Roberts. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, same thing, ZD Roberts. You can find my portfolio of photo work at zdroberts.com, and you can find this and all my podcasts at visu.news. That's VISU.news. And obviously, if you really like this, please head over to patreon.com/zdroberts and contribute there so that I can kind of afford doing more of these without having to try to find an outlet and just doing it straight for you. Anyway, if you want to find out more about the YouTube effect, you can go to www.yteffect.com. That is YTEFFECT.com, or find Alex Winter. I don't think he's on Twitter anymore, so find him on Instagram, Alex Winter. He's there. Check it out.